Anamorphic lenses have always been these special, prestigious things that were usually reserved for the big guys with a lot of money. And that's because there were a lot of aspects to shooting on anamorphic lenses that made it more difficult and therefore more expensive. They always used to be something that just wasn't obtainable. So of course, there's always been this demand for them to be so. And because of the many breakthroughs in lens manufacturing that have happened over the years, we now finally have obtainable anamorphic lenses. We've gone from what used to be giant 22-pound lenses that would cost around $30,000 a lens to things like the Laowa Nanomorph, which are just a little bit over 2 pounds, can fit in the palm of your hand, and are just a bit under $2,000 a lens. Now, ideally, this should be amazing, right? We have a market that is oversaturated with these budget affordable anamorphic lenses. They're no longer something that's being gatekept by the professionals. I'll be honest, this is something that I've always kind of had a problem with, and it's not because I feel like these lenses should be gatekept, but I feel that a lot of these budget anamorphic lens options are just not that good. Now, I'm not going to be going into the entire history of anamorphic lenses and how they came to be, but I do think if we're going to assess what it is that makes an anamorphic lens good, then there needs to be some sort of understanding as to what anamorphic is. There is a lot to what makes an anamorphic lens so sought after, and there's a reason why so many of these Hollywood DPs are still using these lenses today. Anyway, we'll talk more about that soon. I want to get into the reason for that video, and that reason is this. This is the Sirui Saturn full frame anamorphic. I have here the 35mm t2.9, and when Sirui reached out to me and asked me to review this lens, the only real reason I was interested in doing so is because 5 years ago, when I bought my original Alexa Classic, like the big boy, I was looking for a tripod that would hold the 40-pound payload that camera is when it's fully built out, and all of the tripods were like $8,000 or more. But they had one for $1,000 that had like a 50-pound capacity. I still have that tripod today. I still take it on almost every project I do. I've had it out in the desert in a literal sandstorm before, and it survived with no problems. So that's kind of my impression of their brand so far. So I was interested as to what a lens from them would be like. Now, quick disclaimer, they are not paying me. I have no financial agreements with them whatsoever. They did, however, send me the lens for free. I do get to keep it. Sirui, thank you again. All of the thoughts on this lens are going to be my own. And when I say that, I also mean this is going to be a very subjective review. When I am choosing a lens for a project, the number one thing that I am looking for personally is the feel and the character of that lens. Does this lens lend a specific and distinct look that complements the project? And that's also going to come down to what the story is and what my personal tastes are as a cinematographer. This review is not going to be a bunch of rigorous testing. I'm not going to be scientifically testing the optics of this lens. If that's something that you are interested in whenever you watch a lens review, there are plenty of channels that do that. So the only real question that I care about is what look does this lens offer me? Because at the end of the day, I want to put this lens on the camera, I want to look at the monitor, and I want to see how it feels. Now, I've been playing around with this lens for a bit, and I want to go ahead and rip the band-aid off by saying I feel that this lens is a bit guilty of some of those pitfalls I see with budget anamorphic lenses. I think it's a fine lens. It's a good lens. It's objectively a good lens. I'm sure that this lens is probably even somebody's favorite lens, but that's kind of my problem with it. There are plenty of videos on YouTube of people who will talk about anamorphic lenses, and they will boil it down to its most simple aspect, and that is that it's wide. And that's how I feel about some of these budget anamorphic lenses. I feel that they aim to fulfill the simple request of giving you a wider field of view. You see, with anamorphic lenses, there is this mismatched perspective. If you have a 50mm anamorphic lens with a 2x squeeze factor on it, then that lens is going to give you the perspective you would see with a 50mm spherical lens, but you're going to have the field of view of a 25mm spherical lens. This is why anamorphic lenses give you that wide image, and it's also why you would choose to shoot anamorphic instead of just cropping spherical. It's kind of like the jump to full frame. If you're shooting a 50mm lens in full frame versus Super 35, you'll notice that you have a lot more image on the top, bottoms, and sides. It's just a different optical process, and it opens doors to allow you to do things that you probably couldn't do in Super 35. With anamorphic, you're getting a lot more image horizontally. This allows you to try new things with your composition. It allows you to create different feelings and different tones than maybe you would be able to with spherical. In that way, this lens succeeds. It has a 1.6 squeeze factor. It gives you that wider view with that mismatched perspective. It's in every other aspect of shooting anamorphic that I feel this lens kind of falls short. That smooth, waterfall-esque bokeh, the pronounced distortion, that elongated flaring. These are the specific qualities that we've come to expect from an anamorphic lens. It's why they're so popular, but these qualities, they don't just exist in the lens because of that de-squeezing process alone. They exist because of that, but also because of the imperfections in the optical quality of the glass. When you look at a lot of the lenses that are being used in movies, you'll notice one thing, and that's that a lot of them are really old. Super Baltars, Canon FDs, K35s, Zeiss Super Speeds. These are all older vintage lenses with iconic, distinct looks to them. But the reason these lenses tend to look the way they do is because they were made way back in a time where making lenses was a lot harder, it was a lot slower, way less precise. There were mistakes that would be made in the process that would lead to these imperfections, and those imperfections would give the lenses their character. It's also what makes them feel organic. The softness, the distortion, the flaring, the contrast. A big reason as to why I chose to shoot my feature film on Kowa anamorphics as opposed to Atlas Orions is because the Kowas have way more pronounced distortion on the edges, especially on the 40mm. I felt that that gave the film a very strong, distinct look, and this was a film where we really wanted that. Now, I'm not saying that old vintage lenses are the only good glass worth using. There are so many modern sets of lenses that are stunning. Sets like the Tokina Vista Primes, the ARRI Signature Primes, Zeiss's Supreme Primes, even the new ARRI Enzo Primes. These are lenses that are far more optically perfect, but the difference with these lenses is that they are still tuned to purposefully introduce character into the image. They're trying not to be too perfect. They're still given some certain qualities to help them feel more organic because these companies like ARRI know that there is such a thing as being too clean or too sharp. When you have lenses that are too clean or too sharp, they start to feel lifeless and clinical. This is how you end up with like your Canon Cine Primes or your Zeiss CP2s. These are the lenses that like nobody owns or uses except for photography channels on YouTube that are dabbling in cinema lenses because they love things being overly sharp. I think that filmmaking is about escapism. It's about immersing yourself in these stories that are greater than you. It's about life with all the boring stuff cut out. So when somebody says, oh, I've made a lens that is so sharp, so clean that it's like looking through a window, I'm not interested. I didn't come here to look through more windows. I want to look at stained glass. So that all brings me back to the Sirui Saturn, which is a lens that I feel sits a little too close to the likes of the Canon Cine Primes or the Zeiss CP2s in that it's a little bit way too clean without any of the tweaks that helps it feel organic. It just doesn't have that much distinct character to it. And that for me is this lens's biggest problem because it struggles to give me a reason to want to choose this lens other than just to get a wider image. It just doesn't have that painterly bokeh. It has almost no distortion, and when it does, it's pincushion, which I personally don't really like at all. Even the flaring on this lens wide open feels very muted and tame. It just seems to be playing it a little bit too safe, which is not something that I'm really looking for personally in my lenses, especially in anamorphic. I think that Sirui is really interested in creating lenses that are very sharp and very clean, and I think that there is a reason for this that is emblematic of a bigger problem. I want to take a broad look at all of these Chinese lens companies because that's where a lot of these like budget lenses are coming from. China has gotten so good at manufacturing lenses. It's why we have lenses like the Saturn that are optically perfect for $1,000. Whether it be anamorphic or spherical, these companies are aiming to create lenses that capture as close to what your eye sees as possible. And that makes sense because this is the preference of these Eastern markets. There's a rental house in Singapore called Las Kuma Productions, and they sent a bunch of their vintage lenses to my friend's rental house in LA because they just weren't getting used. For them, it was the Tokinas, the Supreme Primes, the Vista Primes, even like the CP2s and stuff. Those were the lenses that were getting the most use. I was talking about this with a friend of mine a while ago, and he had a lot of really good things to say about it, so I'm gonna quote what he said. Jobs in Asia mostly use clean glass for their music videos, commercials, movies. The artists there don't necessarily connect with vintage lenses since they never grew up romanticizing their country's cinema with them. For them, movies are Hollywood, and Hollywood uses the newest and the best. This translates to Supreme Primes, Signature Primes, etc. When someone in the US says, I want it to look nostalgic like a 1960s drama, that means nothing to a DP director born and raised in Indonesia. Also in these countries, business outweighs art. Having modern gear with a modern workflow works out better financially since you bypass the testing and lens matching that you would need to do in a vintage workflow. I know in China, they used to do money laundering through film financing. They would purchase brand new cameras and lenses for tax purposes and then sell them after the project wraps. Because of that, newer modern stuff is more accessible in the used and rental market, which makes it the default camera and lens choice for most productions. Vintage lensing is an advanced elective only offered in the best film schools in China. It's treated as if someone at Harvard Medical School elected a niche class like sub-Saharan African acupuncture techniques between 1907 to 1941. So it exists, but it's just not as prevalent. So there you go. In Eastern markets, there's a much greater focus on having sharper modern glass, where over here, unless you're shooting a beauty commercial or certain client work, we're always trying to dabble in old vintage lenses to give our projects like some sort of look. There is a company called the V35 Project, and their entire business is taking modern lenses like the Canon Cine Primes or the Zeiss CP2s and going in there, recoding and retuning the lenses to make them match older vintage lenses. They'll turn that Canon Cine Prime into a Canon K35 or turn that Zeiss CP2 into a Zeiss Super Speed. I would suggest you look them up and go check out what they're doing with the new DZO R-less lenses because it's beautiful. They're taking what's perfect and they're making it imperfect. Now, I've said a lot of good things about the Blazer Remus in the past. I think that Blazer is one of the very few budget Chinese lens companies that knows what people want in their anamorphic lenses. They are introducing those imperfections, and while they're not perfect lenses, for $1,000 a lens, I do think that they are the most impressive I've seen so far. Look, I really like the form factor of this lens. I think it's cool. It's incredibly lightweight. And I'm aware that the form factor might have limitations as to what they can or can't do with this lens. Maybe all the things that I like in an anamorphic lens just aren't doable in a lens this size, but then I'd say focus on getting the optics down first and then figure out the size. I would be fine with the lens being twice this size, 3 times this size, if it has a beautiful and distinct look to it. Like I said, give me a reason to want to use this lens. Look, let's be honest, there is a lot of snobbery in this industry. There are plenty of cinematographers who don't know anything about lenses, and the only reason they choose to shoot on the lenses they use is because they were used for their favorite movie or their favorite DP uses them. I like to think that I'm not one of those types. I'm not opposed to using an $800 lens over a $30,000 lens if it offers me the utility I need for my workflow and a look that benefits my project. My friend who said that quote earlier was talking to some of the guys at DZO a while ago, and he was kind of saying this exact thing. He was telling them how they should start introducing more imperfections into their lenses because people love the distortion, the flaring, the softness, etc. And he told me that they were just really confused as to why people would want that. So I like to think that all of this is doable, and maybe it's just a mentality thing. This is all just a big, long way to say, hey, Sirui, just think about it. So that leaves the question, would I recommend this lens? That really just depends on your taste. If what I was saying earlier about looking through a window is something that appeals to you, then I would recommend this, absolutely. Like I said, this is all subjective. These are not bad lenses. I do think they're pretty good, and I can see where they fit in the market. I can't really think of any anamorphic lenses that are this clean and this size at this price point. I'm sure documentarians would get a lot of use out of this thing, and I can definitely think of one other demographic of shooters that would absolutely love this thing. This just doesn't necessarily give me what I look for in a lens, but then again, what I look for in a lens is often changing with whatever project I'm doing next. If I had $1,000 to buy a single lens and I wanted something that was a good all-arounder lens, not too funky, not too clean, I would probably, if I wanted anamorphic, I would go with a Remus lens. If I wanted spherical, I would probably pick up a Thypoc Simera C. I would say that those two lenses are the two under $1,000 budget cinema lenses that are really giving you a lot of bang for your buck. I would also maybe say just don't buy a lens at all. Maybe try saving that $1,000 to put towards renting a set of those Kowa Promenars or those ARRI Signature Primes. If you yourself have an upcoming project, like say maybe a short film or something, just call your local rental house and go test some lenses. See what speaks to you. They're more than happy to set up a camera and have you come by. I feel like a lot of young people don't realize that they can do that. If you're somebody who's young and you're getting into cinematography, let's say you went and you bought a Pocket 6K with the 18 to 35 Sigma art lens and you've been shooting a bunch of little videos, short films and stuff with your friends, you can still go to a rental house and test cameras, test gear. You don't have to be some established cinematographer with a production team with a huge budget behind you to go into a shop and get gear. I'd actually say that doing so would help you a lot, especially if you're somebody that wants to make a career out of this, because it gives you a great chance to get your hands on stuff, learn a little bit, and like network with professionals in the industry. I also just thought about it, but there are a lot of rental houses that are nowadays buying more budget-friendly lens options like DZO Vespids, the Blazer Remus lenses, Laowa nanomorphs. If you're really on the fence about what lenses to buy, I would look into what rental houses around you have because that'll give you a really good idea about what is good quality and also in demand. Anyway, I'm getting way ahead of myself. I'm kind of losing the plot a little bit, so I'm gonna wrap this up. Saturn anamorphics. Final thought on these, they're all right. I'm looking forward to what Sirui does next. What I would love to see from them is I'd love to see them have a little bit more fun with their optics and kind of push a little bit more distinct character into those. I think that would really help a lot. And yeah, looking forward to what they do next. Anyway, that's all. Bye.